She was just an ordinary girl, living a quiet life in her village, never imagining that fate had something extraordinary planned for her. But when a single act of kindness led her to an abandoned child, and then another, and another, she found herself at the heart of something much greater than she had ever dreamed. What happens when one girl's compassion turns her into the mother of 100? This is the story of sacrifice, love, and an unbreakable spirit. The morning air was crisp as Zainab walked through the village outskirts, balancing a basket of freshly gathered firewood on her hip. The distant sounds of laughter and chatter echoed from the marketplace, where merchants were setting up their stalls. It was an ordinary day, just like any other, until she heard the faintest cry. She paused, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was soft, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. A baby. Zainab followed the sound, stepping carefully over the uneven ground, her pulse quickening. As she neared the village gates, she saw it, a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth, trembling in the cool breeze. Her breath caught. Kneeling beside the child, she hesitated for only a moment before gently pulling back the fabric. A pair of wide, dark eyes stared up at her, filled with a silent plea. The baby, barely a few weeks old, was cold, weak, and alone. A lump formed in Zainab's throat. Who could leave a child like this? She glanced around, searching for any sign of the mother. There was no one. The road stretched empty beyond the village, disappearing into the horizon. The baby had been abandoned. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the tiny body into her arms, cradling it against her chest. The child whimpered, then nestled closer, as though sensing safety for the first time. Zainab exhaled slowly. There was no question, she couldn't leave the baby here. Carrying the child close, she made her way back to her small hut on the edge of the village. It wasn't much, a simple mud brick home with a straw roof, but it was warm, and now it would be a refuge for the helpless. Inside, she carefully laid the baby on a woven mat, quickly gathering whatever blankets she could find. She had no milk, but she fetched warm water and a little mashed rice, feeding the child as best as she could. As she watched the baby's tiny fingers curl around hers, something shifted inside her. This child had no one. But now they had her. By nightfall, word had spread through the village. Curious neighbors peeked through her doorway, whispering amongst themselves. "Who would abandon a child like this?" one woman murmured. Zainab only shook her head, brushing a hand over the baby's soft hair. "It doesn't matter anymore. The child is here now." An elderly woman stepped forward, placing a wrinkled hand on Zainab's shoulder. "You have a kind heart, my dear. But raising a child is not easy, especially for a girl alone." Zainab looked down at the sleeping infant, her heart full. "I may not have much, but I have love. And maybe that is enough." The days passed, and the child, whom Zainab named Aman, meaning protection, grew stronger. The once frail body filled with warmth, the cries softened into laughter, and the lonely nights became a mother's embrace. But fate, it seemed, was not finished with her yet. One evening, as she returned from the well, she saw a figure waiting at her doorstep. A young boy, barely 5 years old, barefoot and trembling. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with dust. Zainab's heart clenched. "Where is your family?" she asked gently, kneeling before him. Tears welled in his eyes. "I don't know," he whispered. "I woke up, and they were gone." She looked at him, so small, so lost. And in that moment, she knew. Aman would not be the only child she took in. This was only the beginning. The boy stood at Zainab's doorstep, his small hands trembling as he clutched the frayed edge of his tunic. His eyes darted around, unsure whether to stay or run. Zainab could see the exhaustion in his stance, the fear in his gaze. She knelt before him, her voice soft. "You don't have to be afraid. Come inside." For a moment, he hesitated, then, as if his tiny legs could no longer hold him up, he stumbled forward. Zainab caught him, wrapping her arms around his frail body. He barely weighed anything. Inside, she guided him to a woven mat, handing him a small bowl of rice and warm milk. He ate cautiously at first, stealing glances at her, unsure if this kindness was real. But as the hunger took over, he devoured every bite. "What's your name?" she asked. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hassan." "Where is your family, Hassan?" His fingers tightened around the bowl. "I don't know." I woke up, and they were gone. Zainab's chest ached. A lost boy, abandoned or orphaned, left with nothing but the fear of the unknown. She had no answers for him, no way to undo the pain, but she could give him one thing, a place to belong. "You can stay here," she said gently. "This can be your home now." He looked at her, unsure. "Really?" She smiled, brushing the dust from his hair. "Yes, really." That night, as Aman slept soundly in his basket, Hassan curled up in the corner, his breathing even, his body finally at rest. Zainab sat awake, staring at the small forms of the two children now in her care. Aman had come first, a baby left to the mercy of fate. Now, Hassan had followed. And somehow, she knew, there would be more. The children kept coming. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet life Zainab had once known faded into memory. Word spread through the village about the young woman who had taken in the lost and the abandoned. It started slowly, an elderly woman bringing a baby girl left near the market, a traveler who had found a toddler wandering alone by the river. Each time, Zainab took them in. Her hut, once enough for one, now echoed with laughter, cries, and the shuffling of small feet. She made beds from straw mats, stitched clothes from discarded fabric, and cooked meals with whatever food she could gather. It wasn't easy. Some nights, the hunger gnawed at all of them, and she would pretend to have already eaten, giving the little she had to the children instead. Other days, exhaustion threatened to consume her as she worked from sunrise to sunset, washing, feeding, and comforting little souls who had known too much sorrow. But she never wavered. When Aman took his first steps, when Hassan finally smiled without hesitation, when the youngest ones began calling her mama, Zainab knew she had made the right choice. A village divided. Not everyone understood. Some in the village murmured behind her back. "How will she care for so many?" they asked. "She is just a girl herself." Others warned her. "You are inviting trouble. This is not your burden to bear." But then, there were those who helped. A widow named Miriam came one day with a basket of bread and lentils. "I lost my own son years ago," she said. "Let me help you care for these little ones." A merchant who had once doubted her left a sack of flour by her door. A farmer began bringing extra milk whenever he passed by. Little by little, kindness grew. Zainab's home became more than a shelter, it became a place of hope. The mother of many. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Zainab sat outside, watching the children play. Aman, now a sturdy toddler, chased after Hassan, laughter ringing in the air. The baby girl she had taken in weeks ago cooed in Miriam's arms, her tiny fingers grabbing at the older woman's scarf. Zainab exhaled, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle in her bones. But with it came something else, contentment. She had never imagined this life. She had never planned to become a mother. Yet, here she was, with more children than she had ever dreamed of, each one filling a space in her heart she never knew existed. And deep inside, she knew, this was only the beginning. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Zainab's shoulders as the days turned into months. What had started with one abandoned child had grown into something much greater. Her home, once quiet and solitary, was now filled with the laughter, cries, and endless chatter of children who had nowhere else to go. Each morning began before the sun rose. Zainab would wake, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes, and start preparing food for the children. There was never enough. She learned to stretch a handful of rice to feed many, making soups thin enough to fill their bellies yet warm enough to comfort them. There were times when she went without eating, quietly setting aside her portion for the youngest ones. Some nights, as she lay awake listening to the soft breathing of the children around her, hunger gnawed at her stomach. But she never complained. The hardest days were those when illness crept in. One winter, a fever swept through the home, striking one child after another. Zainab stayed by their sides, pressing cool cloths against burning foreheads, whispering soothing words as she prayed for their recovery. She felt helpless as she watched Hassan's small body shake with chills, his once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. "I'll be fine, Mama," he whispered, forcing a weak smile. Zainab's heart clenched. He had begun calling her Mama weeks ago, and each time, the word melted her resolve. She wasn't his real mother, but she had become one in every way that mattered. Through sheer determination and the kindness of a healer who shared her herbs, the fever finally passed. The children grew strong again, But Zainab remained haunted by how powerless she had felt in those moments. Resources were scarce. As the number of children grew, so did the struggles. Space became limited. The small hut could no longer hold them all, and Zainab was forced to convert part of the outdoor cooking area into a sleeping space. The older children huddled together on woven mats, while the little ones nestled against her at night. She sewed clothes from scraps of fabric, turning old garments into tunics for the growing children. Shoes were a luxury. Many ran barefoot, their feet hardened by the rough ground. Water had to be fetched from a well outside the village, a journey that took time and strength. At first, Zainab carried heavy clay pots on her own, making multiple trips throughout the day. But soon, Hassan and a few of the older boys insisted on helping, their small hands gripping the pots with determination. Despite everything, Zainab never considered giving up. The village's divided opinion. While some villagers supported her, others remained skeptical. "She cannot keep doing this," a merchant muttered one day as she passed by. "One girl alone cannot raise so many children. She should send them to the city," another woman whispered. "There are places for orphans there." Zainab heard their words, but she refused to be discouraged. These children were not burdens to be discarded. They were hers, in every way that mattered. One day, an elder approached her as she was kneeling outside, washing clothes in a wooden basin. His weathered face carried wisdom, his gaze thoughtful. "You remind me of your mother," he said. Zainab froze. She rarely spoke of her parents. They had passed when she was still young, leaving her to fend for herself. "She had the same fire in her heart," the elder continued. "She could not walk past suffering without stopping to help." Zainab looked down, her hands tightening around the fabric she was scrubbing. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she admitted. "Some days, I feel like I'm drowning." The elder nodded slowly. "Strength is not measured by ease. It is measured by perseverance." His words stayed with her. Unexpected kindness. Help came in small, unexpected ways. A farmer began leaving extra grain at her doorstep. A seamstress gifted her rolls of fabric. A fisherman shared part of his catch. Even those who had once doubted her began to see the impact of her efforts. The children, once frail and scared, were now thriving. They ran through the village with bright smiles, their laughter echoing in the air. And Zainab, though exhausted, found herself smiling more too. The breaking point. But not every day was easy. One evening, after a long day of tending to the children, Zainab sat by the fire, her body aching with exhaustion. As she watched the children eat, a deep sense of doubt crept into her mind. Was she truly doing enough? Could she keep going? Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She couldn't let the children see her falter. Then, as if sensing her despair, little Aman toddled over, climbing onto her lap. He wrapped his tiny arms around her neck and whispered, "Love you, Mama." In that moment, every struggle, every sacrifice, felt worth it. Because she was no longer just Zainab. She was their mother. And she would fight for them, no matter the cost. The years passed, and Zainab's once small home had transformed into something much greater. The hut that had once been cramped and overflowing with laughter and tiny footsteps had expanded into a larger space, built with the hands of those who had once doubted her and later became her greatest supporters. No longer just a shelter, her home had become a sanctuary, a place where no child would ever feel abandoned again. Zainab had lost count of how many children had passed through her doors. Some had stayed and grown under her care, while others had found new homes with loving families. But they all carried a part of her, just as she carried a part of them. A home that grew beyond its walls. One morning, as Zainab stepped outside, she saw a group of young men standing near the entrance of the village. Their faces were familiar. Boys she had once cradled in her arms, now grown into strong men. Hassan stood at the front, his eyes shining with pride. "We have returned," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "To help." Zainab's chest tightened. Many of the children she had raised had left in search of their own paths, but they had never forgotten the woman who had once saved them from loneliness. Now they had returned, not as orphans, but as men ready to give back. They worked side by side with her, rebuilding the shelter, expanding the space so more children could have a place to call home. With every brick laid, every roof secured, she saw proof that love did not fade. It grew, spreading from one heart to another. The children she never bore, but would always call her own. One afternoon, as Zainab sat beneath an acacia tree, a young girl named Aisha came running toward her. She had been found at the village border years ago, a baby wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth. Now, she was a bright-eyed child with endless curiosity. "Mama, I learned to write my name today," Aisha exclaimed, holding up a piece of parchment. Zainab smiled, pulling the girl into her arms. "That is wonderful, my love. You must teach the others." Aisha beamed, nodding eagerly before running off to join the other children. Zainab watched her go, a deep warmth filling her heart. The children may not have been born of her blood, but they had been born of her love. The village that once doubted, now stood beside her. The same villagers who had once whispered behind her back now stood beside her, their hands offering help instead of doubt. Women came to teach the older girls how to sew. Men arrived with baskets of food, ensuring no child would go hungry. What had once been a lone girl's struggle had become a community's mission. An elder approached her one evening, his eyes filled with admiration. "You have done something remarkable, Zainab," he said. "You have given these children a future." Zainab lowered her gaze, shaking her head. "I only gave them love. They did the rest." The elder chuckled. "And that love has changed more lives than you will ever know. A mother to 100, and more." As night fell, Zainab sat outside, watching as the children slowly settled in for the night. Aman, now a young boy with boundless energy, crawled into her lap, resting his head against her chest. "Mama," he murmured sleepily. "Yes, my dear. When I grow up, I want to help children too. Just like you." Tears pricked her eyes, but she held him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Then you will change the world, my love." In that moment, she realized, her legacy was not the home she had built, nor the struggles she had endured. It was the love she had given, the lives she had touched, and the children who would carry that love forward long after she was gone. She had never dreamed of being a mother. But now, she was a mother to 100, and more. And she wouldn't have had it any other way.